This is Dharma Drops with your host, Rebecca Warfield. This podcast is a little bit about yoga, a little bit about life, and a little bit about whatever. And just as a warning, this podcast is unscripted, so that means I might regret a few things that I say. But hey, maybe I'll say some pretty awesome stuff too. Remember, these are musings, not truths. Buckle up, giddy up, because here we go. Hey, Dharma Drops listeners, it's me, your host of Dharma Drops podcast, Rebecca Warfield, and this is your mini drop episode for Wednesday, July 15th. And yes, it is coming out late. I'm so sorry, but just to be fully honest with you, I'm on the struggle bus. I think like a lot of us are. It's been hard to align my schedule with errands to make sure I have a quiet space to record in. Plus, the new neighborhood that we're in is doing construction, so there's all sorts of noise. And I am just on the coronavirus struggle bus. We have been locked in our houses since March, and I know a lot of people in the world have decided that like the virus isn't a thing anymore and they're just going about their lives, but I'm not one of them. And, it's just been an experience to say the least. So, like everyone else, I'm just doing the best I can over here. But I am here with your mini drop episode for today, which is a little bit different than normal because this will be the first time that I am re-releasing a previous episode. So a lot of you may have seen my post on Instagram and Facebook yesterday. I'm going to read it to you for those of you who maybe aren't following on social media. But basically, in short, I'm over it. I'm over a lot of the attitudes in the yoga community, and I'm over a lot of the conspiracy theory, hoax bullshit, and I'm also over a lot of the performative activism. And so, as I mentioned, the post that I'll read to you in a moment, the episodes that I've released in the last year and a half that deal with social justice, race, diversity, and also episodes that feature people that are not white are my least downloaded episodes in Dharma Drops history. So to maybe just encourage all of us to listen to those episodes, or importantly, to re-listen to them, because we can learn by listening a second time or even a third time or fourth time. For the mini drop episodes over the course of the next few weeks, I will be re-releasing those episodes. And Dharma Drops isn't the only place where you can get information about yoga and diversity, but it does concern me a little bit that when I put out episodes that are just about random mumbo jumbo, those are really popular, but when we have important conversations about things like social justice, it's basically crickets. So I just hope that this will be a great opportunity for us to come back to some important conversations and learn together. But I think I said it best in my own post yesterday on Instagram. So for those of you who already read it, maybe you fast forward. For those of you who haven't read it yet, I'm going to go ahead and read it to you now. And maybe it's kind of nice to get the tone of voice too, so I'm not being like a total asshole. Just a little one. Okay, so here's the post that sums up sort of how I've been feeling lately. I have been relatively quiet on all platforms because I have been unsure how to articulate what I've been feeling lately. But this article, and side note, you can look at the article on the post or you can Google the title and get the full thing there. This article sums up what has been brewing within for years and what is coming to an explosive eruption of frustration with the local and broader yoga communities. I have always questioned some of the behavior in the yoga community. Coming from academia, I not only believe in fact-based evidence and peer-reviewed research, I am confident that it should guide our collective decision-making when it comes to public health and social justice. Sure, essential oils, crystals, love, and light have their place in the world. Even conspiracy theories that engage our desires for a holistic world can be fun to entertain, kind of in the same way a sci-fi movie entertains in an alternate reality. It could happen, but it's not real. But when we spread misinformation in the name of spirituality, we are creating more harm. Sidebar, and the whole point here in the yoga practice is to create less harm and less suffering. Anyway, back to the post. My frustration started with the coronavirus hoax and conspiracy theories. Yoga teachers and, quote, healers near and far, inspired by hokey YouTube documentaries and spiritual skepticism, perpetuated the spread of misinformation and fear. 5G, anti-maskers, Bill Gates, endless mumbo-jumbo that is grounded in story, the very thing we try to let go of in yoga. And these ideas are not grounded in fact. That this behavior isn't new, and I'm looking at you, anti-vaxxers and doTERRA. Don't even get me started on the multi-level marketing essential oil stuff right now. The general distrust of science and medicine within the yoga communities not only instigates a dangerous discourse, it also damages the credibility of the yoga practice. Then, when the country hit a breaking point, refusing to tolerate racial injustice, my frustrations with the yoga community grew exponentially. Well-meaning white yogis were endlessly posting about how much they're, quote, listening and learning, yet my podcast episodes about social justice are the least downloaded episodes in Dharma Drops history. That includes past episodes and the most recent episode with Black guests. Sure, there are other resources than Dharma Drops, but the rate at which I have witnessed performative activism from yogis across the globe has left me unsure of how to be a part of the community. Plus, white yogis talking for the Black community only underscore how unprepared our yoga communities are for social justice work. And that doesn't include the studios who have yet to say anything at all and still feature only young, skinny, white women performing, not practicing, perfect postures. I understand no one is perfect. We all make errors along the way as we learn to navigate the waters of public health and social justice, including me. I'm sure at some points, especially me. However, I am deeply concerned about the collective narrative the yoga community is spreading and has been spreading for decades. If you are spreading ideas about medicine, health, and social justice that were born out of satsang with a bunch of rando yogis and no real professionals on the subject matter, that's a problem. If your yoga teacher questions the validity of real research, that's a problem. If you haven't fact-checked information you share on social media, that's a problem. If your idea of protest is sharing memes or doing yoga in front of a crowd, that's a problem. If your teachings breed skepticism and doubt in the minds of your students, that's a problem. Our community has deep healing to do. We have been steeped in ideology that supports misinformation, and we have been groomed in a whitewashed version of yoga that, though usually well-meaning, doesn't actually support equality or equity. Again, I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I am saying I'm concerned. I hope together we as yogis can do better. And guys, I know that we can do better. I just know that we can. And one of the best ways that we can do this is to continue spreading factual information, to let go of the stories of conspiracy, to let go of these narratives of distrust that really create a lot of doubt in the minds of ourselves and in others, and really start looking at facts. We know this from the yoga practice. We already do this in the yoga practice all of the time. We come to our yoga mats, we start, in the asana practice. These stories arrive about our bodies and about our lives, and we drop into the truth of our breath and what's really happening in the moment. We as yogis are already really skillful at this work, so I'm not really sure why, when it comes to social issues and public health issues, suddenly the realities of the moment don't matter anymore. And all these weird stories that people with no credentials post on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter suddenly have more weight and value than the reality of the moment and the reality of research. Because I hate to break it to you, yoga teachers know a lot, but unless you're an epidemiologist, you're not an epidemiologist. Unless you are an expert in social justice, you're not an expert in social justice. It's just the truth, right? That's the end of the story. So we have to really come back to what we're best at as yogis in being present in the moment and looking at what truly is true in our lives right now. And that means we have to have a lot of clarity about the information that we take in and being really skillful in how we fact check that information. So I encourage you to really think about this. I'm not an expert in this either. I've never claimed to be one. But one thing I consider myself an expert in is information. I teach research methods in composition classes. I have put my time into research methodology in graduate school. I have read and analyzed endless amounts of research. Part of what I do for a living as an English teacher is also teaching people how to discern through information. So I might not be an expert in everything, but this is one area that I feel really confident in. And one thing that I've found in my experience as an academic, as a professional in education, and as an English teacher is that one of the ways that we can learn the most and discern through the most is by conversation, by having conversations, by listening to conversations. So that's one of the reasons why for the next few weeks for the mini drops, I'm going to re-release some of these episodes because conversation is critical. The conversations you have are critical. The conversations you entertain are critical. The conversations that you allow into your life are critical. So with that said, I'm about to part ways with you here and reintroduce some of the episodes from 2019 and actually even in 2020 that talk about some of the things that we're really working our way through right now as a global community. And remember, these are just conversations. When I'm talking with the guests and they are talking with me, we're just kind of working these ideas out too. And it's in those moments where maybe you hear something, you're like, I want to know more about that. That's your moment to pause. That's your time to reflect, to research, to journal, right? It doesn't have to be a linear experience when we listen to conversations and when we have conversations. So allow this to be an interactive experience. Give yourself the grace to learn. Give the people you're listening to the grace to learn. And I think that in the end, we all can create some space to do a little bit better. Okay, my friends, here is your mini drop episode. And we're going to kick things off with Hala Khouri because she has been doing great work with social justice for a really long time. So that's going to set the tone for the mini drops for the next few weeks. All right, friends, even though I've been a little bit grumpy in this episode, I do love all of you very much. And I'm excited for all of us to learn and grow together. Awesome. So thank you so much for being here. Once again, Dharma Drops listeners, you are always so faithful and show up every single time there's an episode. And I'm really excited today to share some conversation with you with my new friend, Hala Khouri. How's it going, Hala?
Hi, I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here with you all.
Me too. I'm so glad you're here and that we're able to find some time to chat. So we were introduced actually through some folks who work for a local organization here in Wilmington. I really want to give them a shout out, Yoga Village. Have you worked with Yoga Village before?
I haven't. This is going to be my
they're
first
awesome.
time.
They're awesome. They're a nonprofit yoga organization here in Wilmington, North Carolina, and they provide yoga practice experiences, asana teachings to communities that are underserved and beyond. And they do such amazing work. And so just a big shout out to Yoga Village for everyone out there listening. Check them out. And you could do something cool like that in your own town too. But Hala is actually going to be here in Wilmington soon. What day are you coming here?
I'm coming on the 18th of October in 2 weeks.
18th of October, 2019. And you'll be teaching a trauma-informed workshop for yogis and yoga teachers?
Yep. I mean, we get yoga teachers in the trainings, but we also get clinicians, body workers, anybody that's working with folks that might be struggling with trauma.
Awesome. And so that's sort of trauma-informed yoga, social justice and yoga is your specialty. And you also mentioned, of course, you're a yoga teacher, somatic therapist, and the co-founder of Off the Mat and Into the World. So you're doing a lot of things, yeah?
I am. I'm quite busy.
Yeah, for sure. But since this workshop that's coming up is really focused on trauma-informed yoga, can you first share with us what is trauma-informed yoga?
Course. I like to say that trauma-informed yoga is people-informed yoga, meaning when we're teaching yoga, I know that when I did my teacher training like 20 years ago, I was just taught to look at students, look at the placement of their bodies, look at muscles and bones, think about safety in terms of musculoskeletal safety. But I was never trained to think about that this is a human being on this mat, right? That might be experiencing grief right now, that might have a trauma history, that might come from a different culture. It was never brought to my attention that these were actually full-fledged humans on the mat. I think I actually thought of my students for a while as like those images in anatomy books, like, oh, they're just muscles and bones I have to put into a particular shape. So I know that I was taught so much about physical safety in my yoga teacher training, but not emotional or psychological safety. And it really, at its core, trauma-informed yoga recognizes that we've all dealt with hardship and that our life experiences live in our bodies. And that most people, I think, are coming to yoga because they want to feel good. You know, they might think I'm coming to yoga because I want a flat stomach or I'm told it'll make me cool or, you know, for more superficial reasons. But I think ultimately we're all just trying to feel good. And especially for trauma survivors, they're carrying an even heavier load of maybe why they don't feel good. So trauma-informed yoga is about yoga for everybody. And it's also about working with folks that are specifically struggling with trauma symptoms. It's about using yoga to regulate our nervous system, not get our feet behind our head or master a handstand. Because, like, at the end of the day, who cares about that stuff?
I was just telling my yoga class today, I teach at the local university. I said, this is yoga. Who cares if you can do these postures? It's what you learn along the way. But I think just going back to some things that you said, I feel like often we forget that when we experience trauma, our bodies are there with us, right? We always think of trauma as just something that happens in the brain, but our bodies are there in the full experience with us. So like you said, we hold that inside the body.
I was going to say, really in the last decade of trauma research, we're understanding that the trauma lives in the body, not in the higher brain, right? And so it's the body that went into fight, flight, or shut down during these overwhelming events. And so the imprint is on the body. And so, to your point, I think we used to think it was in our heads, but it's actually not, because our head can know, I'm fine right now, but the body can feel terrified. So the body has to get the memo that everything is okay, and yoga can help do that.
For sure. And, I've experienced this in my own body. And I've mentioned a number of times on this podcast that I went through EMDR therapy, which works with trauma. And I remember, and I think I've said this before on Dharma Drops, she used to ask me, where do you feel this in your body when we were talking about things? And I would say, I don't feel it anywhere in my body. But through my yoga practice, now if you ask me, where do you feel this on your body? I have the most specific answers, so I feel really confident in putting it out there that we can use the yoga practice to connect with our body and understand where we feel things.
Exactly. And that, like what you just said, is exactly what I train teachers to help facilitate. How do our students learn from yoga how to connect with their sensations in a safe way? So, I call it being fluent in a language of the body. And so it's beautiful that you articulated that, because that's exactly what it's about.
Thank you. So what are some things that you work with in your trainings when you're working with folks, not just in classes necessarily, but when you're working with yoga teachers? What are some things that yoga teachers should be paying attention to or for?
Yeah. So, the first thing I like to do is give people a general overview of trauma and the stress response, like the physiology of the fight-flight response, understanding how the brain works. And ultimately, I'm trying to train teachers to understand that a lot of what we see in the yoga room are people trying to self-regulate. So whether it's that person who just drops into child's pose for the whole class, maybe that's a day that they're overwhelmed and just movement is too much, or that person who has to always do every chaturanga and can't stop moving, right? That if we understand that everybody's just trying to figure out how to feel good and it's going to look different ways, we can start to offer our students tools and start to think about how do we teach in a way that is empowering to students versus that's dogmatic. Because just because it's yoga, I don't believe it's healing just because it's yoga. Like, we can do harm in how we teach. We can re-traumatize people in how we teach. And so we want to understand the psychology of the teacher-student relationship as well. But honestly, I think the most important thing I train teachers to do is understand themselves. The more that we are aware of our crap, I don't know if I can say this on your podcast, right? But of our stuff,
if you haven't listened yet, this is an explicit content podcast. So if you feel the need, don't hesitate.
Watch out. When we're not aware of that, we can really do harm to our students. And I've had teachers back in the day who I could tell, this is their shit, it's not mine. And suddenly they need me to do something so that they feel good. So their trauma then is getting in the way of my healing. Yes. So there's a lot of layers, but at the end of the day, it's not that complicated. Once we have, I always say, a trauma-informed lens allows us to see everything in a way that can create a lot of compassion for ourselves and for our students.
Yeah. And I think compassion's always the key. We've come back to this on Dharma Drops over and over and over again with guests, that compassion is the key. But in order, I think, often to be compassionate toward others, for our students, or just people in our lives, because it's not just yoga practitioners who are experiencing trauma,
Exactly.
For anyone in our lives, we often have to start with compassion for this first.
Yes.
And for those of you listening who are yoga teachers, we've heard this 1,000 times, but the teacher must remain in the seat of the student. for sure,
Yeah.
and that's how we learn to work with our students, by being a student.
Absolutely. And I think it's so easy for some teachers to just be in the role of teacher, and it's so isolating, and they're not getting
Mhm.
support, and they're not, like sitting on the other side of the couch, so to speak, right? And we can't ask our students to do something that we're not doing.
Yes, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
So, we've talked a little bit in terms of for teachers, but for practitioners who might be feeling triggered in the yoga practice, or maybe don't even really know what they're feeling in the yoga practice, what do you suggest they do as practitioners? What are we hoping to do through the yoga practice?
I think for students, I'm really passionate about empowering students to understand that they're in charge of their bodies.
Hmm.
So, thinking about like, is their teacher giving them permission? Is their teacher shaming them to not give their power away? Is their teacher
Hmm.
touching them without their consent? It's so
Hmm.
intimidating to like speak truth to power. And I think a lot of folks, especially people that are new to yoga, they don't know, right? They walk in and they're like, all right, I'm going to do what this person says. But then they find it triggering or overwhelming. And they might think, well, there's something wrong with me. I must be doing it wrong. And I try to say to students, you're not. You're the expert in your body. And a teacher should present themselves in a way where you feel comfortable giving feedback and asking for what
Hmm.
you need. And even when teachers do that, it's still uncomfortable. I know I have a hard time giving a teacher feedback because I don't want to hurt their feelings. I don't want to make them
Yeah.
feel bad. So I always try to remind students, I think they just need information. I remember
Hmm.
getting an email once from someone I'd never met. She'd read an article I'd written about boundaries between a teacher and a student. And she said she was brand new to yoga, and she went to a class and she really liked the class. She said, but the teacher was touching us throughout the whole class. And she said, I didn't really like that. But is
Hmm.
that normal? Is he supposed to be touching us through the whole class? And I said, unfortunately, it is normal for teachers to touch students without asking for consent. And it's quite typical in yoga classes to be touched. But I said to her, but you don't have to be touched. You can tell him, please don't touch me. And
Yeah.
a few weeks later, I got an email from her sharing that she had asked him not to touch her. And that after she'd asked him not to touch her, this was before the class started, she went to the bathroom and she said she started crying. And she shared with me that she'd been a survivor of sexual assault when she was young.
Mm.
So she had experienced unsafe touch by a man, right? So she had a history. And then she went and took the class, and the teacher didn't touch her. And it was so healing for her to set a boundary, have it be
Hmm.
respected, and experience that
Hmm.
safety in the class, right? But
That's awesome.
she didn't know. She didn't know beforehand that she could do that.
So let me ask you, I go back and forth with assisting as a yoga teacher. I was taught a lot of assists. And of course, I was taught in my teacher training, like you never touch anyone without asking, of
Yeah.
course. But I've been taught a lot of things that aren't just alignment or energetic, but are also what I often call feel good assists, like things like
Mhm.
massage, which I've actually pulled away from in the last few years. Part of it is because it's not really my job, I think, as a yoga teacher to make people feel good, right? That's their
Yeah.
work to do. I'm also not a
Yep.
massage therapist. You know
Right.
what I mean? So
Right.
I don't really know what I'm doing. But also, I feel like that crosses a strange boundary. So, what are your thoughts about hands on assisting from yoga teachers? Do you practice them or encourage them?
It's a good question. I personally don't touch barely at all when I'm
Mhm.
teaching. Um, I think that anything can be healing, right? So I think that some people really crave and are touch deprived. So I can imagine for some people being in a class where there's like loving touch with consent offered could be
Mhm.
really, really healing. For me, my theory for how I teach is that if I'm walking around doing a lot of assists and adjustments, I don't know who actually wants it. And even when somebody gives consent, that could be their trauma, is just saying yes because they think they should, right?
Right.
But then what starts to happen is people are focused on me. Am I coming to assist them? I tend
Yes.
to actually stay in the front of the room and model so that people can really just get into their own practice. They're not wondering if I'm coming over. They're not wondering if I'm going to touch them. Of course, sometimes I will walk around and offer an assist if the student is being unsafe and I've
Mhm.
demonstrated, I've said it, they're not able to feel it. I might come over and support them that way. So that's my particular style. But I also know there were phases where I did go to teachers that did more touch because I felt really safe with them and I kind of
Mm-hmm.
just needed to be held. But I agree with you. Like, I think reflecting on our own scope of practice, our own knowledge, and as teachers, our own motivation. And I love what you said about it's not your job to make other people feel good. And
Mm-hmm.
if folks start to get dependent on you giving them this thing to feel good, it can actually undermine their own ability to find it for themselves.
Yes.
Which again, we're social beings. And I think this hyper individualism around like we have to be okay without other people is also harmful. Like, we need other people. And it's okay
Mm-hmm.
to have a healthy dependence on each other that's mutual. Um, and I think yoga can be an opportunity for people's nervous systems to recalibrate and for them to feel empowered about it. So, I always say this in my trainings. I'm not teaching that there's one way to be trauma informed. Almost anything can be trauma informed as long as the teacher has an understanding of why they're doing it and what it's about,
Mm-hmm.
and can sort of gauge what might be right for the student.
I like what you said too about, because it's not just about like being touched or not being touched in assisting, but there's also that dependency and even worry that's created. I've experienced this a lot in my own yoga practice, where I'm like, is she going to come next to me? Why didn't she assist me? Like, did I do something wrong? Why is she ignoring me? Or the opposite, why am I doing everything wrong? Why does she continually come over here and
Yes.
correct me every single time? So my own experiences in that have actually led me to stop assisting in my classes. And of course I give energetic assists, or alignment, or and just say to them like, hey, pull your hip this way, whatever. But I've really tried to stop these like big full body, like hands-on assists.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. That's a great reflection. I'm the same way.
Yeah. It seems like a little just much for me, for sure. So I know you also work with social justice in yoga, and I think sometimes these two topics might seem different, but I do think that to recognize trauma-informed practices is also to recognize social issues in our culture and lives too. So can you speak a little bit about what you're doing in terms of social justice within the yoga community?
Yeah. Well, when I train teachers, it's important that in a trauma framework, we understand that some people are dealing with what I like to call structural violence or oppression, things like racism, homophobia, sexism. Those can be very traumatic to people, right? To walk in the world in a body that is a target is a trauma. And so if we're only framing trauma in terms of personal and interpersonal events, and we're not actually framing that the systems that are meant to care for us, such as the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, financial system, politics, those actually harm some people. And they harm some people more than others. And,
sure.
and that injustice is a trauma. But I also believe it's a trauma to everybody, even the people who benefit from the injustice. Like, if I know that I can feel safe walking down the street because of my white skin, but I know that's not true for everybody, I have to carry, or I do carry, the guilt of that or the shame of that. It's not fair. Even though I benefit, I'm going to be negatively impacted. And so I think that a trauma-informed framework that doesn't take into account these larger systems is incomplete. And a lot of the folks that come and take our trainings are working with incarcerated people or people that are struggling with poverty. And a lot of these are like undocumented or Black and brown folks. And we need to understand the history of why certain people and certain groups get marginalized and others don't, so that we want to be careful to not go in with like pity, or, like, it's like if you're working with incarcerated people, if you have an idea that, well, I'm working with criminals to help rehabilitate them, that's actually a harmful perspective. So a lot of the people that are incarcerated are not incarcerated just because of their crimes. They're incarcerated because of their race and or their class. And somebody who might have done the same behavior but comes from a different race or class may not find themselves incarcerated because of it. And so making sure that we're understanding these larger systems is important, so that we don't come with like a savior mentality or pity or even blame.
Yeah.
And then understanding our own privileges, our own disadvantages, do we come from a marginalized group or not? And, most people are complicated, but, our identities are not like binary, right? So understanding also how our perspective has been shaped is really, really important. So part of being trauma informed is understanding injustice.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I really like what you said. We all feel this, even if we aren't the ones who are marginalized or oppressed. It just makes me think of the concept of karma in some ways, that it's a ripple. And when things happen, it stretches out and touches us all. So we don't just walk around free of things. When one person suffers, we all suffer. We might not feel it explicitly, but implicitly, we do feel it for sure.
Yeah. And I think that for people that might have the privilege to be in denial, right? Like if we're protected by these systems and our healthcare isn't threatened, our body safety isn't threatened, then sometimes our work is to get more proximate to that suffering, is to actually move towards suffering and discomfort so that people that don't have that choice can be alleviated of it a little bit. So, we all have like a different role to play. Like I know I can be in my bubble. I have, economic stability. I get, even though I'm an immigrant, I'm an Arab, right? But I pass, my husband is Black and Jewish, but, I still in my own personal life feel like I can be really protected. So I move towards discomfort. I work with incarcerated people. I have people in my life that are like lower income or struggle with mental illness. Like I could step away from anything that makes me uncomfortable. But I don't, because, I need to stay awake. Some people don't have that choice. Their everyday life reminds them of injustice.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that brings me to a question then, which you kind of answered, but for those of us who maybe are, like you said, in this sort of protective bubble, how do we move toward discomfort?
Mm-hmm. I think the first thing is self-reflection and education, right? So like for white folks, like reading things like the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo is a really,
I haven't read it. I've heard it's very good.
It's so good because it's written for people like us, for white people that like don't perceive themselves as racist and want to make the difference, right? It's not written for like people that are actively racist necessarily, right? So it's really great. Reading a book like The New Jim Crow or a documentary 13th, right? Understanding, for example, the history of race in America. If you are a white-skinned or white European person in America, understanding the history of why we can walk around in the way that we do now is important, right? And I know that you have listeners all over the globe. So like thinking about the particular culture that you're in and understanding the history is really important. And a lot of times our work is to then go get other people who are like us to be thinking about this, right? Getting uncomfortable. And then we want to look at like, what policies are we supporting? How are we voting? Where are we putting our money? I think everybody has a specific way that they can push up against a culture that, normalizes and prioritizes certain groups and marginalizes others. It might be like, if you have a company, can you hire more people from like, different races or different genders, right? And it's not just about diversity, but being inclusive. Okay, now that we have more diversity, how do we make sure we don't replicate the problems that are in the world now within our organization, right? So it's a lifelong journey of education, self-reflection, and action that just keeps repeating itself.
Yeah. And I think when we can move toward these things, then how do I even want to articulate this? When we can move toward these things, we're able to understand others better, which brings us back into connection. So if we're yoga teachers, we can understand each other better. And, I think for me, this is something I like to believe, that I understand other people's suffering. But I do live in a small, relatively white community, and it's definitely segregated. I live in the American South, so there's some things happening here for sure. But for example, the yoga practitioners, 99%, they're all white. And so that's why Yoga Village, just going back to the beginning of the episode, is doing such good work, because they are moving toward these other communities. And I don't even, maybe moving toward suffering, but just moving toward diversity, inclusiveness through the yoga practice. So it's really exciting that they are doing that, because it's not happening everywhere.
Yeah. And where you all are, there is such a history, right? I mean, all in America, in all of America, there is. for sure. And it's something that, everybody has to face in their own way.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
thinking about like you were saying, like if there is a person of color in the yoga room, understanding like they might not feel safe surrounded by white people, and have you done your own work as the teacher on your own internalized racism and implicit bias? A big one that shows up in yoga is fat phobia, like
Yes.
so many of the images we see are thin white ladies, right? So if a fat person comes into the room, they might also feel self-conscious. If somebody with a disability or somebody who's not neurotypical, right? Some of the ways that people are like different from what we consider normal, right? Is, and I'm using air quotes here for folks that are listening. So people who might not perceive that they fit in, they're going to feel especially vulnerable in yoga spaces if they even dare walk in. So, I talk a lot with like studio owners about like, what imagery are you putting up? If people don't see themselves in the images or in the teachers, they're not going to think it's for them, right?
Right.
And so that's another way we become inclusive.
Yeah, for sure. I had a friend who she moved here from Milwaukee, which I think has a different sort of yoga community vibe than what we have here in Wilmington. Not that there's anything wrong with the Wilmington yoga community necessarily. It's just a smaller town, less diverse, Yeah. And when she moved here, I had just started teaching yoga. And although I am a white woman, I'm much taller than the average yogi in our community. And also, though I don't consider myself full-bodied, I'm not petite by any means, And I felt just that alone. I felt very out of place when I first started practicing yoga. And my friend told me, she said, I think what's going to happen is you will draw more people who don't feel comfortable in a yoga class. Yeah. Because I'm not 100 pounds. I'm not 5 feet tall, and she was right. My classes, suddenly I had these women who were 6 feet tall. And a number of them said to me, I never really felt comfortable going to yoga because I was always the tallest one.
So interesting.
Yeah. And so this is small. We're just talking about things like height, but imagine if then that is expanded into things like race, right? And gender and sexuality and religion and all the other things. So if that makes a difference, just when we're talking about tall women,
I know, right?
Then it makes a huge difference to people who are feeling marginalized in their entire communities.
Absolutely. And that's why I love too when there are classes, like I have a friend who teaches a queer and trans yoga class, and it's really
cool.
explicit about who it's for, so that the folks that go into that class aren't looking around wondering, am I the only one, right? Or yoga classes for people of color. Like sometimes these affinity group classes, will explicitly let people know like who the class is for, and can allow people to like not have to be hyper vigilant to like, am I the only one? You could do a tall people's yoga class.
A tall people's yoga class. I'm actually not that tall, but there is such a sort of like, and I'd say this without judgment, but there is sort of a cookie cutter image of the yogi in our culture. Like if you look on Instagram, it's not really true. When you go to a yoga class, I mean, obviously not everyone is like 4 feet tall and 100 pounds,
Right.
But when you look at Instagram or something like that, it looks very monochromatic, if you will, Yeah. So I definitely do believe that if, we have, especially if we have teachers that represent diversity, more diverse populations will come in too.
Absolutely.
I had a podcast episode with a woman, Chiquita Boone, who lives in Greenville, North Carolina, and she talked about that because she is African-American and she considers herself large-bodied. And she said, if we have more people that look like this teaching, more people practicing will come.
Absolutely. Yeah. I remember a couple years ago, I did like a half-day wellness retreat for pregnant teen girls coming out of foster care. And a yoga studio had donated the space. And I walked in, and most of these girls were African-American girls, and they were pregnant. And most of them were also just bigger bodied before being pregnant. And there was a yoga magazine sitting in the lobby, and they were sitting around. They'd never done yoga. And on the cover of the magazine was a thin white woman in like some fancy inversion. And then you open it up and then you see somebody like on rocks with feet behind their head. And they were mortified. They were looking at this and looking at me being like, this is what we're doing today. They were so scared. And I said, no. And I immediately looked up Diane Bondi's website, and she's a fat black yoga teacher. That's how she identifies herself. And a couple of other women that looked like them. And I said, this is yoga. And they all just, They settled.
Yeah.
And then they were willing to practice because they saw images that reflected them back to themselves.
Yeah, for sure. So in addition to trauma-informed yoga and social justice yoga, you're also teaching, or I should say you are the co-founder of Off the Mat and Into the World. So I actually don't know a tremendous amount about that. Does that tie into the trauma-informed and social justice yoga that you are working with?
Yeah, Off the Mat got started about 12, 13 years ago.
Oh,
With
wow.
myself, Sean Korn, and Suzanne Sterling. And back at the time, there was a group of organizers from San Francisco. They actually had worked with Julia Butterfly Hill for a long time, the woman who sat in the tree for 2 years, in case folks don't know. And they were doing political organizing. And they wanted to figure out how to get the progressives more politically coherent. And they thought, well, let's, what work could we do? Like what progressive communities exist that we could do some organizing in? And the yoga community, at least out here, was people that identify as more progressive. I know now there's, tons of diversity in terms of how people identify
Sure.
as yogis. But they came in and they wanted us to help use yoga to connect people to their purpose. And again, whatever their authentic purpose would be. And so, we started doing these like yoga and activism trainings and workshops and getting folks together to just talk about their values and their purpose. And we developed this training called Yoga in Action, where it was really supporting people to use yoga to reflect on themselves and their own values to find purpose and meaning in the world. And so it developed into leadership trainings. And then as they evolved, we realized that if we weren't bringing in the larger historical context, there was a really big missing piece. And so the curriculum really evolved to include social justice and oppression and privilege, and basically an anti-oppression lens. So we lead trainings and intensives, the three of us. We have an incredible faculty of people that lead trainings, and then we have online trainings. And we have our vision and what we've been doing is sparking leaders, taking people that are in leadership positions who want to be in leadership and have them do that self-reflection piece, think about their leadership. So everything is trauma-informed in that we want people to be reflecting on these larger systems as well as themselves as they go out and do whatever their leadership is. And so that's what we've been doing for the last 12 years.
That's awesome. I did not realize that it was going on for 12 years. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you're really pretty ahead of the game here. Because not that these conversations are new, but I think they're sort of a little hyperactive right now in, current discourse and stuff. But it's awesome to know that you guys have been doing this for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome.
We feel like we've been training our whole lives for this moment, right? Of like, how do we not contribute to further division, right? Like yoga's union, right? What we see now is we can't tolerate different opinions, right? We can't tolerate people who are different than us. And how do we start to move past that and see each other's humanity and think critically, right? I mean, it's not that all viewpoints are equally valid. Some are definitely misinformed, but how do we dialogue about that and listen to each other?
What I really like about the work that you're doing is it brings such a level of depth to yoga and yoga conversation. Because one thing that sort of has worn me out a little bit actually in the yoga world is a lot of watering down of ideas or even just ignoring the work that needs to be done within our lives, within ourselves, within our communities. And, I'm kind of hard on it sometimes. I'm always like, all the love and light, not that things shouldn't be nice, but really what the work of yoga asks us to do is to dig deep and to do good in the world. And we can't do that when we spiritually bypass, when we're just like all love and light. We have to look at the ugly truths of the world and then do something about it. The Bhagavad Gita says yoga is skill in action. So how can we skillfully be in this world and serve others? Yeah.
And I think that like the yoga community, some of them are very guilty of that bypass, of spiritualizing bypass, right? They're like, oh, that's negative, or namaste, we're all one. Yes, that's the truth, but that's not people's lived experience. So we have to go through that muck and that dirt to get to namaste, to get to that we're all one. Absolutely.
That's right. Gotta get through that veil of all this craziness. And hopefully one day we will get there for sure. But
Yeah.
it's difficult work and it's not always fun. That's the other thing. This work is not fun to do.
It's embarrassing. I always say, like, if you're not feeling humiliated periodically, you're not doing the work.
If you're not embarrassed, you're doing it wrong.
Exactly. And there's so many layers. I keep thinking, like, all right, I've arrived. It's like, nope, there's another layer. Like, it's never over. Like, there's so many layers of our being and our conditioning, right? And again, our culture that does condition us with so many biases, right? I'm reading a really great book right now called Normal Sucks. And the author talks about, like, this creation of this idea of what's normal was based on all these studies of Harvard white men. Literally, like whether we're talking about health or psychology, like all of this research was done on, like, wealthy white men, and, like, that's what's normal. And everything else is abnormal. And so, like, everybody else is secretly feeling like we're not enough and something's wrong with me, because these standards have been set in our culture about what normal is, right? And so, and even those people, the white men who fit that's a burden, because that's not even their truth, right? Like, they have to perform this normal, and they don't get to be broken or have all these other parts of themselves. And so, I'm excited to move towards a world where there's no such thing as normal, and everybody's included, and we are curious about each other in all the ways that we're different from each other.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's exciting to visualize it. It's just going to take a little work to get there. But I really do think that we can do this as a community. We truly can. We just have to stay committed. And I think it's easy to get burned out with this stuff. So I know you and we just met, but listeners, they probably know if they've been listening for a while. I teach at a university. I teach English and literature. And so a lot of the work that you're doing is really in the same vein in what things like in literary studies are doing too. But it can be so daunting and exhausting and soul crushing sometimes. The burnout is real. So do you have any suggestions for people who are doing this work or want to do this work? How can we stay committed and really nourished along the way too?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because I think, the burnout is really real. And, I think that, like, I think people need to think about what their piece of the work is. You're not going to save the world, right? We're not going to do all the work. So think about what your piece is and do your piece, and be in community, so that you are remembering that other people are doing their piece of the work, right? You're not the only one. And make sure that you're getting support. Like, it doesn't serve anybody for you to be burnt out, especially if you have the opportunity to not be burnt out. I've been working a lot on play and fun, which, I know I'm getting burnt out when I'm like, the world is in crisis. There's no time for fun, and it's like, all I do is thinking about the world is in crisis, and, I'm raising kids, and I have 2 young kids, and I don't want to raise them to be these, like, pessimistic humans that just are giving up before they even have a chance to feel hope. And so that's been an amazing reflection for me. Like hope is what motivates us. And so what are we doing to keep hope alive? What are we doing to remember that ultimately most people are really good?
I was just talking about this last night. I went to dinner with some girlfriends, and we were saying that most people in the world are really good. We just get bogged down with the bad.
We really do, because the news reports all the bad. It doesn't report all the good. And so we need to make sure that we're getting fed, and that we remember that the truth is most people want connection. Most people want to feel safe. Most people are really kind. And, even my little kids were supposed to teach stranger danger. I don't. I tell them most of the people around would help you if you needed it. Be discerning, trust your gut. But most people are really kind and would help a kid in need, because I want them to grow up in a world where they feel hopeful. And that when we then look at the ways that things are lopsided, we understand that it's not out of people's, maliciousness, that unfortunately we live in a system that has lopsided values, that values profit over people, that, doesn't value the planet, but it's the system. And we individuals are inside the system. We drank the Kool-Aid, and we have to wake up and really remember what's important. And so if we have a chance to live a life where we are in connection with people we care about, having moments of ease, that will remind us what we're working towards.
Mm-hmm.
We need to.
I think something you said that's really important is that we don't have to do it all and we can't save everyone and everything. Something that's really near and dear to my heart is the sentiment that there is a space for all of us to be activists, but you don't have to be an activist for every single thing all of the time. And there's a lot of pressure for that. Like there's all this pressure in the yoga community to be a vegan, and there's pressure in academia to be a feminist. There's pressure all around the world to be an environmentalist. And I agree with all of these things, but I can't give 100% passion to every single one all of the time, and there's a space for all of us to do our good work.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and then reflect on, so that is, we have to do that. And once in a while, really reflect on, where am I doing harm? Where could I do a little bit? Where do I need to get a little bit more uncomfortable? Right. So it's like that balance of like getting uncomfortable on purpose. And then when it gets to the point where it's disillusioning or too much, then we step back. Right. It's like, moving forward and moving away. Like, I know now I'm back to with my family reflecting on like how much plastic do we use,
Yeah.
But because in part of my own overwhelm, I started like, instead of making my hummus, which is what comes from my family, I now buy it in plastic tubs, right? I did all this stuff for self-care, and now it's kind of gone a little too far. And I'm like, okay, I'm a little better now because I'm not cooking as much, but now look at all the plastic we're using. Do I have the bandwidth right now to look at that? Okay, let's look at that. So it's like moving in and out of some of this stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's definitely an ebb and flow with these things. And for me, I'm like better at some things at sometimes than others, just like your hummus example. Mm-hmm. Sometimes like I'm really great at using less plastic, and then sometimes I'm not. But when I'm not, I'm usually wrapped up in something else, like advocating for education,
right.
Or something. So it's just, I think it goes back to what you said earlier about self-regulating and just taking the time to see where we're at and checking in. And are we doing the things that are serving not just ourselves, but everyone the best ways that we can? Doesn't have to be perfect.
Exactly. And I think if we strive for perfect, we're not going to do anything, and then we make things worse.
That's right. So Hala, you're going to be in Wilmington. Tell me one more time. I know you already told me. I forgot.
Yes. The training is October 18th through 20th.
Okay.
It starts on the evening of the 18th, that Friday evening, and then we go all day Saturday and Sunday. And, it's mostly yoga teachers and clinicians, as well as, folks who do yoga, who just want to learn more about the practice. And, people who are, working in different capacities in spaces, whether it's addiction recovery, foster care, hospitals, medical community, first responders. I find that we just get a diversity, 50% is yoga teachers and the other 50% tends to be just everybody else. And it's a really special training. This is my 11th year teaching it. And so it's really evolved over the decade. And I really love it. And another really special thing about the training is the community that gets formed is you get to meet other people that have similar interests, and oftentimes collaborations come out of that community as well.
Yeah, that's cool. Mm-hmm. And so, as I mentioned, we do have listeners across the globe. For people who are like, I don't know what Wilmington, North Carolina is, and I'm not going there. What are some ways that they can learn more from you or get in touch with you? Are you offering any events elsewhere coming up soon?
Yeah, I offer my training online once a year, and we even have recordings of like last year's training online. So they can always go online to my website, which is halakhouri.com, my name. And I offer trainings, and, Kira Haglund is also another facilitator, and Ardub Alves is another facilitator. So if they go to traumainformedyoga.net, they'll see our schedule, and we're all around the country. I can't even think about where I am right now because it's everywhere. But I'll be, I'll be doing one in California the weekend after I'm out there in Wilmington as well.
Awesome. Great. This is excellent information. So again, you said traumainformedyoga.net is the schedule. Yeah. Awesome. And then your website is halakhouri.com. Yes. Mm-hmm. And for folks listening, you can access those links in the show notes. Hala, is there any big takeaway? If there's something that like every listener, no matter where they live, should know before this podcast episode ends, what should it be?
No pressure.
No pressure at all.
Well, let's see. I'm just thinking about something I often like to say to folks, which is, whenever people come to me for therapy and they've never been in therapy, they feel like they have this big dark secret, and that they're more messed up than everybody else. And I always try to say, we're all fucked up. Like we all are. It's no big dark secret. Nobody has it all together. And that when we can, that having shame for the ways that we are broken or that we feel like we're less than, that the shame often stops our healing process. And if the first thing we can do is normalize our humanity, then our healing can really begin. And I think yoga can be that tool. And so I'm really passionate about having people release the shame, the stories that they were told about who they should be, and move towards healing. And so for the students of yoga, I hope they can bring that into their practice. And for the teachers, I hope that they can think about how to support students in that process.
I think that's a great way to wrap things up. No pressure at all. That was perfect. I think that was a great takeaway.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was such a great conversation.
Yes, of course. And thank you for being here. And again, for those of you listening, you can get the links in the show notes, and you can get more information about Yoga Village in the show notes. Hala, I forgot to ask you too, do you have any social media outlets people can find you on?
Yep, I'm on Instagram at Hala Yoga, and I'm on Facebook at Hala Yoga or my name, Hala Khouri.
Okay, awesome. And then you guys probably already know this, but you can find me on Instagram at Dharma Drops Podcast and at Rebecca Warfield Yoga. Facebook, Dharma Drops Podcast, dharmadropspodcast.com, same, all over the internet. So Hala, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time and sharing this really important information with listeners.
Thank you, Rebecca. I loved it. I loved talking with you. It was great.
Yes, it was great. All right, guys. Well, until we meet again next time. Bye.